Good afternoon. My name is Ananya Kumar. I'm the Associate Director at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center. Today I'm here at the IMF headquarters with an esteemed group of panelists to talk about digital development. Thank you for being here. But before I introduce them, I want to frame our conversation a little bit today. It is very fashionable to say that we're living in unprecedented times. It's never been truer than today in this moment of polycrisis as we're dealing with the impending and compounding effects of a climate change, as we witness numerous wars and their economic fallout, and geopolitical instability globally. At this moment, it's imperative to remember that Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, were born out of a similar geopolitical movement. They were born during war and not after it. It's very prescient to me to think about this in this building as we start our conversation. But since then, our world has changed considerably, and technology has played a big part in how we live our lives and how it's become more efficient and streamlined. And as countries are addressing economic challenges and digitizing public and private services increasingly, private sector has a big role to play, and we're trying to connect people more efficiently at the end of the day. So today we're going to talk about a few of those issues as they've come up in places like Gaza, in Ukraine, in Afghanistan, where we've seen a lot of financial sector and digital development try and find solutions to the problem that exists there. And we'll talk through the issues of financial inclusion, measurement of the impact of these kinds of technologies and these programs. And I want to invite you to indulge in a little bit of reimagining how digital development can be utilized for reconstruction. So thank you for joining me. And I'm happy to introduce Candice Kelly, who's the Chief Legal and Policy Officer at Stellar Development Foundation. She used to work for Uber before this. Thanks for joining us, Candice. And I'm also very happy to introduce Kay McGowan, who's a Senior Director for Policy at the Digital Impact Alliance. Kay joins Dial from USAID. So thank you both for being here. Candice, my first question is to you. Ukraine has become one of those countries that is seen as an example of a digital destination, and its goal of building a digital state has been realized even more since the last 2 years at the outbreak of the war. And your company, the Stellar Development Foundation, along with UNHCR, has worked to use the Stellar Distribution Platform and the Transparency Network to help Ukrainian refugees and build a little more transparency into how aid gets distributed. Can you talk about the importance of these programs and how they've aided post-war reconstruction in Ukraine?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here. And just a very quick, many people are not familiar with the Stellar Development Foundation. So we're a nonprofit organization, and we sit at in an ecosystem. We support the Stellar blockchain network, and our mission is creating equitable access to the global financial system. So in that capacity, UN reached out to us, UNHCR, when the war started, and we had already been working with the Ministry of Digital Transformation in Ukraine, and we're very well aware of how digital forward President Zelensky is and how they were really using digital solutions, and to be able to distribute aid using the Stellar blockchain, using a USDC token, a stable coin, and being able to cash out at MoneyGram locations, or having MoneyGram use ACH transfers because they're so digitally forward and there's not a huge unbanked situation there. Those two options are there. So they've already distributed $2.2 million in aid and using that solution, and I think it's 1,600 people who've received aid using that. And through those learnings, we have been thinking forward in terms of reconstruction. When you look at the numbers, I mean, the estimates, like I've seen $500 billion in aid. So being able to deliver that and to address the issues of transparency and traceability and auditability is really important. And we see that on the smaller scale of giving aid to individuals, but when you think of that scale, we have been working with the Independent Association of Banks of Ukraine and DCM, a private company, to just now sort of standing up a transparency network, so being able to use that as a fast payment system. And I think when you look at the scale of what the reconstruction effort is going to take, and then you look at some of the statistics on 30 to 40% of aid not reaching its destination if you look globally because of fraud or corruption, and being able to have that transparency both for donors and for international, I think it's going to hopefully be a game changer in making sure that the aid actually gets to where it needs to go, whether it's for humanitarian individuals or for the reconstruction effort.
Thank you, Candace. Kay, I want to turn to you. We talked a little bit about your experience at USAID, which ultimately, helped you. You helped decide which programs get to be funded and how to fund them and how to implement them on the ground. And you've worked quite a bit on developing inclusive financial infrastructure in Afghanistan specifically. I want to talk a little bit about what learnings you've gotten from those experiences and what are some of the necessary conditions for financial inclusion and financial infrastructure to work in possibly war-torn circumstances.
Great. Ananya, thank you so much to you and the Atlantic Council and my fellow discussants here. It's a real pleasure. This is an incredibly important topic. So thank you for putting this on the map today during the meetings. We've had now about 15 years or so of investments in digital development with the explicit purpose of trying to accelerate human development and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think what we've seen is that you need to be very intentional, both about the way the technology systems and products are designed, but also around the policy environment, right? So we think pretty automatically now about data protection and privacy and cybersecurity, but often what gets left out in the design and the delivery of aid is thinking about that last mile, especially when you're talking about some of the poorest countries in the world where I've worked, and people that are not as comfortable and as used to transacting online, right? So you have this kind of remarkable spread, even in Afghanistan, of coverage of mobile telephone infrastructure and semi-affordable broadband, but you still see huge usage gaps, right? And a lot of that is because you have not had the investment in, especially when we're talking about payments, in making both sides of the market work, right? So, you mentioned cash out, right? Cash out networks are important, but if you actually want to get highly inclusive financial infrastructure to endure over time, and you want to use either humanitarian aid or development assistance to try to make that market, you actually need to think about a lasting acceptance network, right? Where you're using public spending and ODA to actually help prime the pump and match both users, customers, beneficiaries, whatever you want to refer to people as, or maybe we could just say people, with places to spend that money, right? And so you have to be very careful and very intentional about that. And that's been one of the big lessons and tripping points, in particular for the delivery of humanitarian aid digitally. And then the other piece that I would say is kind of equally important is thinking about how you create a competitive marketplace and get those incentives so that you have financial service providers not just creating little fiefdoms and sucking away data and dominating that, but actually that they're operating within the incentives to serve the needs of all customers.
Thank you, Kay. I think your point about last mile connectivity and building sustained trust in any kind of technological invention is very important because, of course, no one's going to use a product if they don't trust to use it. And then it's about building the mechanism of trust, too. Right. It's about whether I trust the mobile phone that I'm using to access my wallet from and things like that. That's something we talk about quite a lot in our center. I want to turn to Deputy Minister Olga Zykova here, who started at the Ministry of Finance in Ukraine in May 2022. A difficult time for Ukraine, but she's really seen it through many achievements in the last 2 years. And I want to talk a little bit about an event we did last year with your Ministry of Digital Transformation. Not a lot of countries have a Ministry for Digital Transformation, and not a lot of them during war would like to talk about it quite as much, but Ukraine is an example for many states that are going through a similar geopolitical state, and it's because Ukraine's been investing in digital infrastructure for a long time. Deputy Minister, I want to give you the stage to talk a little bit about how you see and where you see the most need for digitization 2 years since Ukraine's invasion by Russia, and what role do you think that e-government tools that you have existing today play in Ukraine?
Great question, and thank you for having me today. It's actually, the topic of digitalization, especially under the current conditions Ukraine found itself in, is critically important. You're rightly to say that we are moving towards this path quite quickly, and it's a rapid developments in terms of making the state digital. What Ukraine shows is actually the e-government innovation, and a very small sample of how we started. Actually, if we track ourselves back into the COVID crisis time, we were thinking of how to provide people with the open tool to have the vaccination done. So here is how we developed the so-called DIA system with the proper applications in the mobile phones, so that put together all the documents of the citizens for them to have easy access to have the vaccination certificate available in their app, simply in the mobile phone. Then we moved further because people were restricted from spending some time within the COVID crisis, having actual live stream as normal as usual. So we thought that the government should support these people, and we provided additional funding that could be actually received by the citizens within DIA system application for them to spend this funding targetedly earmarked for purchasing books, for instance, or for some leisure part of the story. But then we developed to the point that actually it's not enough for us to have people only fully getting all the documents in their simple app. Actually, when the war started, when Russia launched its invasion, we were thinking of how to make citizens' lives easier under such drastic conditions. And we proposed one of the tools to invest into the military campaign, which is war bonds. So we have never had such a coverage of interest among citizens prior to putting the war bonds available in DIA system simply to get into the app and purchase the bond and invest into the military campaign of the country. So this is the sample how we started to grow, and this growth was quite rapid one. So as you know, during the last 3 years, and almost the full time of the war conditions, Ukraine made a very sophisticated approach towards making the state digital itself. So now, for instance, in the application we have 14 documents available, more than 40 services, public services available for people wherever they are. It is a trend-setting exercise, and I think that it has been reflected in all the ratings and indices available worldwide. But what matters is that what effect it has. So on one hand, it has a very sufficient economic effect, as we see how people can easily start business. They can register as individual entrepreneur in the system. They can actually put together all the documents needed within a very sophisticated and easy way, in an automated way. Secondly, there is a huge anti-corruption effect. So actually we assessed the potential anti-corruption effect of having all these services being digitalized for approximately $400 million per year. So this is where we see that there is high demand on the system to be further developed, and we are not stopping there. So now Ukraine being one of the trendsetters in this digitalized approach towards the public services, towards documentation avoiding inefficient communication, bureaucracy, avoiding corruption. It makes the state performing strongly on this regard. And if we take a look at who are the users of actually these benefits, these are the people who seek for help and support. So we have, for instance, the opportunity for people to actually purchase the certificate if their house was damaged or ruined during the war. In this regard, we have a clear monitoring system on who the beneficiaries are. We track the whole monitoring system, and it helps us to attract the respective funding from donors to monetize the vouchers. On the other hand, we have people who want to support and want to give a helping hand. And this is where they can actually provide information for the citizens who need the help. Again, within the DIA system in place. But it's not only about DIA. We are working heavily with the IFIs, for instance, in many projects, mainly now on reconstruction and quick recovery. It requires, for instance, the rules of the procurement of the IFIs in place, and we already elaborated a sophisticated system, Prozoro system, procurement in Ukraine, which fully reflects the criteria that are to be in place so that the project is being implemented in a sufficient way. So the role the digitalization plays for Ukraine, especially now, is critical, and the tremendous efforts have been put in place, but I see how the system actually grows, and we are trying to be a trendsetter in a good way, so that other countries which seek for the samples to be complemented on their side actually have it in place and can take it and use it as a ready crafted product.
Yeah, I just wanted to actually flag this point because I think Ukraine has become a real leader in digital cooperation globally. And opening the source code base of DIA is really, it allows other countries, so they don't have to spend 10, 15 years building it. It allows them to pick it up and customize it, which is a tremendous boon.
Yeah, and this goes into two things that we talk about quite often. One is the role of open source networks, which are critical in trying to develop technology that can actually be transferred and used across a range of services. You're not just talking about one kind of use case for DIA. You're talking about everything from an entrepreneur trying to break into starting a business to how bonds get financed and the financing of a government. That's a very expansive view of how an economic network works, and it's actually the correct view of how technology works.
Yes.
It's many stacks built on top of each other, which is what open source allows for. The other thing that you talk about is knowledge sharing. We're at the IMF today. We're all in sideline meetings where we're meeting with a range of countries, a range of IFIs to try and talk and influence each other on technological standards and products that we need to use. And this is the part of spring meetings that's very exciting for me, is to get to hear from different countries and where they are too. I want to bring you in, Candace, to this conversation. We talked a little bit earlier about the Stellar Disbursement Platform, which is in use in Ukraine, as well as the Transparency Network. We talked about how valuable collaboration is for the delivery of aid and how we need to talk to each other about the technologies that are being used. When you think about the reconstruction of Ukraine and other places that have been affected by war, what role do you think the private sector can play, and what kind of help do you need from the public sector to enable that environment?
It's a great question. It's something we've learned a lot about through our work with the UNHCR on that project. That was UNHCR and a self-hosted wallet provider and MoneyGram, and of course we had to be in close communication with the Ministry of Digital Transformation, the National Bank of Ukraine, because especially in those early days, we didn't want to bring a solution that could undermine the local currency, but because of the way it was designed, we made sure that it didn't do that. And we also, we're the technology player in that group, and the UNHCR taught us so much about how that wallet has to be designed and how let's limit the functionality because it's for a very limited purpose, but build it in a way that's open and open source. And so as more functionality and as people get more educated and comfortable with the technology, that wallet could change and provide other things. With the Transparency Network, similar with the Independent Association of Banks of Ukraine, there were merchants involved. You were talking about that last mile and getting more than just the recipients involved. The merchants, the government, donors, because if you don't design and work together to build a solution, you're going to miss out on some incredible, so you're going to make a big mistake. And I think that certainly the private sector brings a lot of, I hesitate to say this when I'm sitting next to someone from Ukraine because you're so innovative and move so quickly, as particularly in the time of war. But I think more generically, if you look across the globe, the private sector innovates more quickly and is a little bit more agile. And so that's something that we bring, but also being just so mindful of building solutions with the local folks involved so they know what the real issues are. And at the same time, we are very mindful of trying to do that, knowing that it will be open source and can be used in other contexts, which we've definitely seen with the Stellar Disbursement Platform. Was built very laser focused on this issue in Ukraine, and now it's being used for payroll.
Yeah.
Right? It's like if you can do bulk disbursements, there are more and more companies that have a remote workforce and getting paid across borders. Even the UN has been using it. It's great. That's the other benefit of open source is that you might build it thinking, oh, this can be used in these 10 ways, and then someone sees it and they say, oh, well, here are another 10 ways. And then they contribute and maybe change, and it's a live, dynamic process.
Yeah, and this is why it's important to not be overly prescriptive about how people are going to use the technology, because use cases are going to evolve as people play with the tech a little bit more and realize that they can be used across different kinds of needs. I want to talk to you a little bit about the role of organizations like USAID, where the IMF and World Bank, international financial institutions, and what they can do in a moment of reconstruction in Ukraine and other places.
Yeah, so I think actually the role of bilateral cooperation agencies as well as the big multilateral institutions is really critical, right? Because there are a lot of lessons from all over the world about what policy choices, what types of consequences those have, right? And so I think that there's an important role to play in both knowledge sharing and also just really widely sharing best practices and helping policymakers and countries do some scenario planning, right? If you want to see X in the market, let's work backwards and think about what that means for your regulatory, your policy environment, because as we all know very well, the kind of natural tendency in the digital world is for networks to become monopolies, right? And so you have to be really careful about that if you want a diversity of players in a competitive market. There's also a lot that I think they could do in terms of creating some innovative financing vehicles. For example, I know in Afghanistan, one of the big tripping points for some of the most innovative digital payments providers has been that the way aid procurement, so I'm glad you brought up procurement, the way aid contracts are written, they usually have the financial service providers front the money, right? And then get reimbursed on a cost reimbursable basis. And that's just simply not possible for smaller payments providers. And it often requires, in a place that's truly where the financial infrastructure is really truly devastated, like in Afghanistan, it requires working on, if not the black market, the gray market to amass that cash, which kind of self-defeats the whole idea of transparency that you get through going digital.
No, that's correct. And I did some research recently on Gaza and the payment situation in Palestinian territories. We've all talked about this sort of individually and bilaterally, but one of the things that happens when all kinds of financial networks are cut off is that you're essentially introducing a lot of risk into the system, not thinking about the consequences in the long term. So something that we've been talking to the Palestinian Monetary Authority about is that cutting off correspondent relationships has actually led to proliferation of AML-CFT issues, which of course is crucial for that region, but these unintended consequences and the lack of competition, like you talk about, really adds up to a lot of risk in this environment that prevents truly innovative solutions to actually work. And that's something we need to realize across a whole range of countries. I often say that cutting off correspondent banking is like effectively sanctioning a country, because you're cutting off any ways of letting money in and out of an economy, and people still need money to function, especially in a circumstance of reconstruction. Deputy Minister, I want to go back to you and talk about this question of choices. I know you've had to make a lot of hard choices over the last 2 years about which projects to prioritize, both in terms of physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure. How do you and your ministry think about where to prioritize, and what would help in prioritization?
So actually we walked through long path within the wartime. So since 2022, we have lessons learned, and here with the support of the IFIs, the IMF, World Bank, and others, we elaborated tools not only to be able to attract the respective funding needed for filling in the fiscal gap and put in additional strength towards rapid needs projects, but also in terms of being clear on transparency and accountability. So the trust we have been building with the partners takes a long history, but it is the good one. So actually the trust built within the previous years helped us to make sure that all the instruments that are being put now together to channel the funding and to report on the use thereof is actually done for the purpose of the transparency and accountability of Ukraine as a reliable partner, right? So with regard to the reconstruction efforts, the critical point is about first setting the priorities. So actually with the government work on two big streams. The first one is filling in the fiscal gap, which means actually in practice to be able to pay salaries to teachers, to healthcare workers, to pensioners, elderly people. On the other hand, we have a big path we are working on reconstruction and very rapid recovery, which is actually making us think about the adaptive approach together with the partners. And this adaptive approach, it includes digital solutions put there too as well, because we cannot allow ourselves for the mistake in terms of the use of the funding. That's where the transparency is needed. At the same time, we understand that without the digital tools in place, it will be difficult for us to remain the same track of communication with the IFIs and foreign governments. So with this regard, we are thinking of the prioritization as, being a bit flexible here, because things change drastically and quickly. So for instance, recent damages done on energy facilities, they require us to react respectively and to reflect our request to the donors in a due course, so that to make sure that we have the facilities to cover the energy blocks, that we have the anti-missile systems in place, etc. So all of that is we cannot set a clear frame for, let's say, a month period, because there is too much uncertainty outside. But at the same time, we are clear with the partners that we are moving with the structural reforms. With this, we are putting together the system of public investment management that will allow the donors and partners to understand what we really need, so-called a single project pipeline, which actually help us to frame this dialogue in a better structured way. But here, digital tools are critically important in terms of putting enough transparency. So, for instance, when the donors are asking what are the damages, which are actually reflected in the priorities, here we come up with a cooperation with the World Bank regarding the rapid damages and needs report that they are introducing already the third year in a row. This is our basis where we understand that the digital tool is to be introduced to have a very clear coverage of monitoring how these damages are moving and where the priorities has shifted or have shifted or not. So with regard of making the choice, we are always keen on very key core line of helping our military with purely internal resources of the budget while asking the partners to provide the concessional funding and grants for covering the social expenditure so that the citizens are covered with the critical functions the government should perform. At the same time, we cannot avoid the focus on reconstruction, and this is where we cannot afford ourselves to put something aside. Housing, energy, transport, social infrastructure, we cannot put something in a separate basket. And this is where this flexibility of partners and adaptive approach is very needed.
Yeah, thank you for that. And of course, it's you're talking a lot about the reform process and transparency and accountability, all of which are requirements for the EU accession of Ukraine,
Right.
which I'm sure you're thinking quite deeply about this week and as you talk to the IMF. I want to pivot to something you mentioned, which is how digital transformation can help in monitoring and evaluation. What we've seen happen in a lot of cases is that something works once in a while, and then all the money goes into that one thing that works, and everything else gets ignored, and we don't do enough monitoring and evaluation. And I want to talk a little bit about how you measure the impact of these programs, especially programs meant for financial inclusion and development. So Kay, I want to turn to you, and then Candace and Olga.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and very timely because I've just been in recent conversations around the real need for a set of global metrics around digital public infrastructure, right, and its impact on people. Because when you think about these foundational digital systems and the registries, the payments layer, the identity layer, all these things that build up into something like DIA being able to provide dozens of different services, it's really hard to pick out different pieces and say, well, this piece has this impact, right? And so while I think while the development community has done a good job at coming up with measures of maybe access and usage, say of banks, right?
Yeah.
Bank accounts through the World Bank's Findex, right? That still doesn't give you the whole picture of what the underlying infrastructure, the way it's designed, the policy choices that are made around it, how it's impacting people and impacting markets. And so I think there needs to be a really serious effort actually to think a little more holistically about what all of this means for people. I was in Ghana a week before last and got to spend a day with some informal trash pickers. And their kind of stories of both being kind of lifted up by digital, in particular by mobile money, but also the kind of new risks introduced to their lives. For example, when the undersea cable was cut a few weeks ago and the payment system went down, that sort of thing, it just really showed how careful you have to be, right? And so I do think this impact assessment deserves a lot more thinking.
Candace, do you want to talk a little bit about how you think of impact assessment as a private sector company often providing these services?
Yeah, I think it's a challenging area for us because we're really the technology layer, right?
Yeah.
And so it's always depending on others to implement that and be the user facing. And so I think the way we think about it is, what tools can we provide that help the government, help the people who are on the ground to have that information. And so the open public immutable ledger is really the answer to that. And I know there are a lot of blockchain companies that talk about the open public, it's all there it's not always that easy. So for example, with the transparency network. Our partner is working on more like a user interface that makes it much easier to actually trace and track and audit that blockchain, because it's there.
Yeah.
It's there, and there are plenty of tools, but trying to make sure that we have the tools that the users that easily extracts the data that they need, I think is really important, and open sourcing them, of course.
Yeah, yeah, a lot of discussion on open source today. Deputy Minister, I want to turn over to you as we're headed to the last few moments. You're in a lot of conversations this week. I want to talk a little bit about what you think a successful takeaway would be from the spring meetings here.
Actually, what is always a successful story to tell is when you're leaving such margins with a plan. So a plan ahead is actually to cover the financial world here and to make sure that we are working in a coherent and supportive way, so that to make sure that Ukraine is equipped with the means of putting together the reform agenda and being the reliable partner to IFIs in implementing the projects that are critically needed in terms of reconstruction, and making sure that we are looking beyond 2024. So with this, it's not an easy exercise, I would say, especially now with all the disturbances worldwide you see on the geopolitical agenda. Too many questions arises, newcomers with more conflicts to come, with more uncertainties with the global powers, right? But at the same time, I see clearly that Ukraine and its path towards victory is on agenda. This is critically important, and with regard to making sure that this plan that we are elaborating during this week, literally elaborating the plan, it actually lays ground towards this year on several tiers. Having enough external funding for the fiscal gap and for having the social expenditures which our citizens need covered, to have the conversation on what funding is to be used towards the reconstruction efforts, including the conversations that are ongoing more actively in comparison with last year's with regard to the use of the Russian assets and seizure of Russian assets. And the third one is actually to make sure that we look beyond 2024 in terms of the EU accession, how we elaborate the Ukraine plan on the European Union Ukraine facility, and that we have the donors making a joint decision rather than having, bilateral pieces of advice provided.
Of course, yeah.
So this is our plan, and we would like to have it as our target to be met here.
Great. Thank you so much for your insights, and I'm hoping you achieve all those metrics over the course of this week. Thank you, Kay and Candace, for joining us today as well. As many of you know, this is a part of our IMF World Bank event, meetings event that we hold twice a year. This year we're both in our studios at the Atlantic Council as well as here at the IMF headquarters. This was an event that really helped me think about and reimagine some of the ways that we think about the role of technology in our financial architecture. So thank you for joining me and for bringing your insights to this event. Follow us for our work and sign up for our newsletters, and thank you.